Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you all about this. It's a topic I really care about. It's also something I've taught. So I signed this article by Anders and Davida, and I've given it to my students in the past, and they say that they understand like 60%. So I'm hoping that y'all are closer to 80, or, if not, I'm going to go a little bit over it. Feel free to ask questions. Maybe you didn't get to it. That's fine. I will still go over it. But that's normally what I give my undergrads to kind of get a first taste of what this topic is about. So the article does a really nice job, I think, of giving us some background of where intersectionality emerged. It didn't come from nowhere. It has these longstanding kind of relationships with these sort of two areas. That would be critical legal theory. And I have also added in feminist jurisprudence, which is kind of the same domain, and then critical race theory. So looking at critical legal theory and feminist jurisprudence, what are these up to? Well, what they're primarily doing is they're analyzing how certain forces affect legal construction. So for feminist jurisprudence, looking at sex-based forces like patriarchy, sexism, misogyny. But when we're talking about critical legal theory, this can be broader things, cultural ideologies like capitalism. And so what's really key here is it's not just saying, okay, how is this force like patriarchy happening around the legal system, but no, how is it involved in the actual construction of our legal system? So what it's doing is it's confronting the alleged neutrality or objectivity of the law. I think this is something that we like to think is true of the law. It's like comforting to think that, our words are neutral. And so that's why we use textual analysis for statutory interpretation. But our words reflect our world views. They're influenced by these forces that our cultures have. And so what critical legal theory is doing is unpacking how these forces are affecting legal construction to show that it's not exactly a neutral system. It has influence in other ways. And there can be good ways. It's not always negative, but critical legal theory is mostly concerned with the negatives. So that's tracking hegemony and power. An example of this, if that's like way too much theory for your brain, if we look at property law, and that has origins in John Locke's theories of nature and the presumption that a man can take ownership of land when he mixes it with his labor, cultivates that land, and makes it productive. And so that's kind of where we get our laws about property. And it also makes sense then to understand something like adverse possession or squatters' rights, to say like, if you as the owner are not doing much with that land, but someone else is, they're making it productive, then they actually have some claim to it because there's a presumptive value that land is valuable only when it is being cultivated. But what that shows is a cultural ideology of capitalism, of saying that land and nature are inherently valuable for what they can do for humans and not just as a sort of intrinsic force. And so that's a way in which critical legal theory would kind of analyze property law, track what forces are involved in the construction of it, seeing how power operates in that domain. All right, that is a very fast snapshot, but that's kind of what's going on over there. And then the other bucket is critical race theory, which we've already talked about a fair bit in this class, but I'll keep going with it. So it's adding basically that race piece to what critical legal theory is sort of up to. So analyzing how institutionalized racism in the law or other social systems is kind of at work. So we see this in the economy, education, politics, all over. What's really key here is it's revealing the ordinariness or permanence of racism. So unfortunately, this is partly my opinion, partly also what's coming from this article. I think it's fair to say that, our legal system was built on some racist ideology. And so when we see examples of racism in our legal system, that's not exactly an aberration or unusual, an error, or an indication that the system has failed. It's actually how the system was meant to operate. It's only with intentional trying to change that, that we don't have as much of the racism that maybe once was. So again, it's that ordinariness rather than treating it as this kind of aberrational, unusual thing. Also, critical race theory is concerned with not just understanding, but trying to change the relationship between law and racial power. And so this can be kind of where we try to draw the line, though I think it's a little bit gray, of what might just be a statement of fact about our racist history and a specific counter narrative intended to reframe the way that we understand our history and hopefully making it better in the future. All right, so from these two domains, we then get Crenshaw's intersectionality. And the kind of overview here, really straightforward, is she's basically saying when an individual experiences discrimination on account of multiple identity traits that are separately discriminated against, when they intersect, this effect is unique and greater than just the mere summation of those different traits individually. So for math people, I'm sorry, but 1 + 1 does not necessarily equal 2, is kind of what she's saying. So when we look at the kinds of prejudices that, you know, from her perspective, she's talking about Black women face, there's stereotypes that are uniquely targeting Black women on account of that intersection. So like Melissa Harris Perry talks about in Sister Citizen, she talks about the mammy stereotype or the Jezebel stereotype, hypersexualization. These are things that, you know, not Black men face nor white women face. It is specifically Black women. And that is a compounded, unique, specific kind of discrimination that is more than just looking at experience of racism or an experience of sexism. And this applies to lots of different kinds of identities. It's not exclusive to race and gender. That's just where she's kind of focusing, especially considering, again, those origins of critical race theory and feminist jurisprudence. Makes sense that that would be where she comes from. So the article talks a little bit about these sort of 3 domains in which intersectionality is really important to reveal some of these discriminatory effects or problems that we have. And so she talks about it on a structural level, which I've already sort of narrated, talking about like our legal system and how this affects access to resources and employment opportunities, and how when there's a failure to acknowledge compounding intersectional discrimination, then people fall through the cracks. And when these structures have opportunities that are kind of rigid along certain paths that never cross over. She also talks about political areas. So for example, you know, the civil rights movement was about race, women's movement was about gender, but there's not exactly a Black women's movement specifically to account for these nexes. I think there's more now, especially with the reproductive justice movement. But at the time that she was
writing— With the what movement? I'm sorry.
The reproductive justice movement.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So it's getting there, but she's talking a little bit more mainstream. When we look at our politics in these big movements, they're usually along single axes, addressing race, addressing trans rights, orientation, you know, these kinds of things, rather than talking about the intersecting experiences. And then representational, as we can kind of see, and as one of the articles that Tim brought last week about how seeing Kamala Harris was such a big deal, like represented as an intersecting kind of identity, it's extremely rare. And so individuals in power often represent one group, but seldom these intersecting ones. All right, so that's kind of what she's up to. Before I click on this video, I kind of want to see, has anyone already seen this TED Talk? Because no point spending time. Maybe like raise hand if you have seen.
When I try to click on a TikTok thing, it says you've got to get in through Facebook, and I say I give up.
Okay. Well, if it's all right, it's a little bit longer. It's like 10 minutes. Is that all right, Professor?
Okay. I mean, by the time I get to talk, I may have lost my mind, but we have that every week, so.
Okay. Well, I think it's important to hear directly.
Okay. Hit
from
it. Hit it.
Crenshaw.
By the
So
way,
let's
could you
do it.
post the name of this article so people could write it down and then maybe email me? The one that you're summarizing an article, didn't you say that?
Yeah, the one that I sent you via email that you
Oh, I'm
sent out.
sorry. I forgot. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine.
But
Okay.
did I, and I sent it to the class, I guess, didn't I?
Yes.
Okay.
Hopefully folks got it. But if you didn't, I just gave you majority overview.
Got it.
So let's dive into this. I'm gonna jump around a little bit because it's longer, but we'll see most of it. And if someone can like yell and wave if you don't hear it, I should be sharing sound, but just let me know if you don't.
You got good technical skills.
Years. Rights organizations, I've done it.
All right, so to give you quick context, she does an activity where she says the names of people and everyone is standing up. If you have not heard those names, you are asked to sit down.
Is it Kimberly Crenshaw talking?
Yes. So the names that she lists first that most people stay standing for are all Black men who have been killed by police. The second group is Black women killed by police, and the disparity in knowledge is drastic. So that's where she's coming from and where we'll get started.
Be the case. I mean, there are two issues involved here. There's police violence against African Americans, and there's violence against women. Two issues that have been talked about a lot lately. But when we think about who is implicated by these problems, when we think about who's victimized by these problems, the names of these Black women never come to mind. Now, communications experts tell us that when facts do not fit with the available frames, people have a difficult time incorporating new facts into their way of thinking about a problem. These women's names have slipped through our consciousness because there are no frames for us to see them, no frames for us to remember them, no frames for us to hold them. As a consequence, reporters don't lead with them, policymakers don't think about them, and politicians aren't encouraged or demanded that they speak to them. Now, you might ask, well, why does a frame matter? I mean, after all, an issue that affects Black people and an issue that affects women, wouldn't that necessarily include Black people who are women and women who are Black people? Well, the simple answer is that this is a trickle-down approach to social justice, and many times it just doesn't work. Without frames that allow us to see how social problems impact all the members of a targeted group, many will fall through the cracks of our movements, left to suffer in virtual isolation. But it doesn't have to be this way. Many years ago, I began to use the term intersectionality to deal with the fact that many of our social justice problems like racism and sexism are often overlapping, creating multiple levels of social injustice. Now, the experience that gave rise to intersectionality was my chance encounter with a woman named Emma DeGraffenreid. Emma DeGraffenreid was an African-American woman, a working wife, and a mother. I actually read about Emma's story from the pages of a legal opinion written by a judge who had dismissed Emma's claim of race and gender discrimination against a local car manufacturing plant. Emma, like so many African-American women, sought better employment for her family and for others. She wanted to create a better life for her children and for her family. But she applied for a job and she was not hired, and she believed that she was not hired because she was a Black woman. Now, the judge in question dismissed Emma's suit. And the argument for dismissing the suit was that the employer did hire African Americans and the employer hired women. The real problem, though, that the judge was not willing to acknowledge was what Emma was actually trying to say, that the African Americans that were hired, usually for industrial jobs, maintenance jobs, were all men. And the women that were hired, usually for secretarial or front office work, were all white. Only if the court was able to see how these policies came together would he be able to see the double discrimination that Emma DeGraffenreid was facing. But the court refused to allow Emma to put two causes of action together to tell her story because he believed that by allowing her to do that, she would be able to have preferential treatment. She'd have an advantage by being able to have two swings at the bat when African American men and white women only had one swing at the bat. But of course, neither African American men or white women needed to combine a race and gender discrimination claim to tell the story of the discrimination they were experiencing. Why wasn't the real unfairness law's refusal to protect African American women simply because their experiences weren't exactly the same as white women and African American men? Rather than broadening the frame to include African American women, the court simply tossed their case completely out of court. Now, as a student of anti-discrimination law, as a feminist, as an anti-racist, I was struck by this case. It felt to me like injustice squared. So first of all, Black women weren't allowed to work at the plant. Second of all, the court doubled down on this exclusion by making it legally inconsequential. And to boot, there was no name for this problem. And we all know that where there's no name for a problem, you can't see a problem. And when you can't see a problem, you pretty much can't solve it. Many years later, I'd come to recognize that the problem that Emma was facing was a framing problem. The frame that the court was using to see gender discrimination or to see race discrimination was partial and it was distorting. For me, the challenge that I faced was trying to figure out whether there was an alternative narrative, a prism that would allow us to see Emma's dilemma, a prism that would allow us to rescue her from the cracks in the law, that would allow judges to see her story. So it occurred to me, maybe a simple analogy to an intersection might allow judges to better see Emma's dilemma. So if we think about this intersection, the roads to the intersection would be the way that the workforce was structured by race and by gender. And then the traffic in those roads would be the hiring policies and the other practices that ran through those roads. Now, because Emma was both Black and female, she was positioned precisely where those roads overlapped, experiencing the simultaneous impact of the company's gender and race traffic. The law was like that ambulance that shows up and is ready to treat Emma only if it can be shown that she was harmed on the race road or on the gender road, but not where those roads intersected. So what do you call being impacted by multiple forces and then abandoned to fend for yourself? Intersectionality seemed to do it for me. I would go on to learn that African American women, like other women of color, like other socially marginalized people all over the world, were facing all kinds of dilemmas and challenges as a consequence of intersectionality, intersections of race and gender, of heterosexism, transphobia, xenophobia, ableism. All of these social dynamics come together and create challenges that are sometimes quite unique.
All All right.
But in the same way,
Nope, we're going to keep going. Professor, you're muted. Can you hear me?
I wanted to ask you how recent the talk is.
I think it's actually a bit old at this point, like a decade.
Okay.
I don't know if it says up here. I can share the link. I'm sure it says. I want to
It's
say.
not that important, but I just wondered. In a lot of ways, the insight, as she explains it, it doesn't have to be updated in a lot of ways, I guess, because she's giving us her core insight.
Absolutely. So I just wanted to do a few other quick little things here. One is to say that Crenshaw gets the sort of credit for coming up with this concept in specifically the legal domain. And she absolutely should, not disagreeing with that. But I want to kind of recognize that this concept has been around forever and that a lot of different communities have been raising it in different spaces. And so it's important, again, to see that kind of larger history, to position Crenshaw where she's coming from, but also to say, like, hey, judges, like, this is actually not a new phenomenon. You finally have someone who's giving you a tool to see it, but these issues have been around for quite a while. So the kind of famous Sojourner Truth, Ain't I a Woman speech in the 1850s is often accredited as an example of intersectionality. And then, Combahee River Collective really kicked it off in the 1960s. It's a Black lesbian collective of women. Loretta Ross with the reproductive rights. 1970s, we have Ntozake Shange, and 1980s, Audre Lorde, Angela Davis, Bell Hooks. So all of these Black women, some of whom are queer and disabled, really had this conversation for decades. Similarly, other communities, so Indigenous queer women like Sakala Sa and Sarah Winnemucca, Beth Brantley Miracle, Sarah Deer, Leah Bedasamosoki Simpson, like this is just a really rich topic that a lot of groups have discussed. And yeah, Latinx women as well. So Martha Quintera, Gloria Anzaldúa, Aida Hurtado. Like, I haven't done my homework on everyone, so I'm still learning about like Asian women who've discussed this, Middle Eastern women. There's lots of different groups. But again, it kind of shows that this topic has been around for a really long time. And Crenshaw was the first to kind of put a name to it, specifically in the legal space. So not just scholars, also comedians. This is a short video. It is just fun to kind of, anyway, I think she's fun. And I think she brings up a lot of these issues. So it's a little light humor. All right, this is basically my last little statement that I just wanted to make. So with the article that I gave y'all by Anders and DeVita, they're doing that history of intersectionality for a specific reason. And I think this reason's important enough to restate. The context for their writing here is that scholars, particularly white scholars, are problematically oversimplifying intersectionality without understanding this history. So what they're trying to do is prevent the kind of tokenism that happens or even extractivism. So taking a concept out of its context, using it incorrectly just for clout or popularity, as it's become this really key like buzz term now. So they're saying as their thesis that scholars need to do their homework on the history and the complexity of intersectionality to prevent the kind of misuse of it or even the co-optation of it that can easily happen. So that's why they're saying intersectionality is situated at this nexus of critical legal studies, critical race theory, and personal embodied experiences or identity politics, which has a lot to do with that feminist jurisprudence element that I bring in. And then at the end of their article, they talk about applying this to a real world context. So they show how universities try, but often fail to support marginalized students with intersecting identities, especially for like queer people of color. So there's the Black Student Union, and then there's the queer organization, but where do you count for students who are in both communities? Do they kind of sever their identities just to find community? It's a problem that they raised at the kind of end of this to show how those different pieces, structural, political, and representational intersectionality can help illuminate these problems. So I also included this little picture. I think it's pretty helpful to see how the concept of intersectionality isn't just about identity, which you see kind of in the outside label of things, but it's about how power relates to this. So tracking where the power is in relation to certain kinds of identities show us how intersectionality reveals this and is really important to changing this ideally. So why does this matter? I mean, I hope it's obvious, but in case it's not, some of the things that I've sort of taken away from this is that it's important to know that our legal system was made by and for, white, cis, straight, able-bodied Christian men, and that continues to be the locus from which other rights have expanded. So going back to this picture here, this circle, the centrality of power being around these inner circle identity traits has been where our legal system started. And as we've added more kinds of accounts for other identities protecting against discrimination, because we're built on precedent, there's like these links in a chain that still connect back to that centrality. So if we think about recent cases like Bostock versus Clayton County in 2020 about transgender discrimination and sexual orientation discrimination, the Supreme Court finally found that the term sex discrimination, which has usually been about protecting women, could also include protecting trans individuals and queer people. But what the court did to kind of do that reasoning was to like draw those links all the way back to the center and say, by recentering like cis heteronormativity. And so it's keeping that centralization of those traits and extending outward. And so that again gets to how racism is not an aberration, it's kind of built in, and the work that needs to be done here is pretty big to make some significant changes. So failing to recognize intersectional discrimination both invisibilizes that harm, as Crenshaw said in the video, and it maintains those mechanisms that cause harm. So things like critical race theory and others can identify these mechanisms and hopefully offer some change.